let's proceed to our next part or to the next part of our discussion in skeletal system, which is bones. Okay? So let's define first what is bones. Okay, bones is living tissues that makes up the body's skeleton. So meaning to say it is a living tissue or a rigid living tissue that constitutes part of the skeleton in most vertebrate animals. So aside from that, bones also can protect the various organs of our body. It also can produce red and white blood cells, store minerals, provide structure and support for the body, and enable in a certain function, which is mobility. So bone tissue is made up of different type of bone cells. So that is the definition of bones. Okay, let's proceed to another. Bones are considered organs because they contain various types of tissue. Kaya nga sinabi ko na there are different type or bone tissue are made up of different types of bone cells. And one of a tissue is or we can consider that a bone is a type of a rigid or living tissue. So it also said that osteocyte is the living cell of bone tissue form the mineral matrix of the bone. Meaning to say, inside of the bone there is a osteocyte, or you can eventually seen osteocyte, or the location of osteocyte is inside the bone. These are the cells that inside the bone. They are also come from osteoblasts. So from the osteoblast or from the sum of the osteoblast, it will in turn into osteocyte. While the new bone is being formed, and the osteocyte then gets surrounded by the new bone. They are not isolated, of course. However, because they send out long branches that connected to the other osteocyte. So that is the explanation of osteocyte. So always remember that osteocyte is a cells that can be located inside the bone. Okay? So aside from that, always remember that the baby's body has about 300 bones at birth. So remember the number of the bone if in the particular stage, like for example in the baby, we have 300 bones. The adult human skeleton is made up of 206 bones. Okay, so in this part, I've actually mentioning the bones in the skeleton. So let me ask you a question. So the question is, are bones is a skeleton or bones is a part of skeleton? Of course, yes. Bones provide a rigid framework known as the skeleton. Meaning to say, the function of the skeleton is the bone is the same. They are can support and protect the self organ of the body. The skeleton also, or the bone, supports the body against the pull of the gravity. Okay. So that is why we can conclude that bones are skeleton. Okay, let's proceed. So these are actually a representation of the different types of a bone. Let's, for example, skull, vertebral column, shoulder girdle, and upper limbs. We have thoracic cage, pelvic girdle, and lower limbs. So there are 206 bone to be exact in an adult human skeleton. But if you are a baby, you have 300 bone at birth. Okay? So what is the reason why do newborns or the baby have 300 bones? So lahat naman tayo napipicture the question on why there is a 300 bones in the baby's body, while in the adult human skeleton it is made up of 206 bones. Eventually, the explanation of that is babies have more bones than adults because as they grow up, some of the bones fuse together to form one bone. So that is why a baby's body has a 300 bones at birth. Then in the adult human skeleton, we have 206. So eventually kasi, as the babies will grow, the bones can be fused. Namimix na siya, napafuse na siya. That's why from the 300 bones, it will made up of 206 bones in the adult human skeleton. Okay? So now let's proceed. So I've already mentioned it. This is actually the representation of the types of the bone. So to be exact, adult human bone 206 bones. And I also answered why the baby has a 300 bones and the adult has a 200 bones. Bakit nga? Because babies have more bones because as they grow up, some of the bones fuse together to form one bone. That is why from 300 bone, bumabagsak siya into 206 bone if the baby now will grow as an adult. Okay? Let's proceed. So let's now, since I've already mentioned the types of the bones, let's figure out what are those types. So in a bone, as an organ, two types of bone tissue are represented. We have compact bone and the spongy bone. A compact bone and the spongy bone. Okay, remember that one. So in the illustration, I have a quite quick or a summary of the differences between the spongy bone and the compact bone. When we say spongy bone, these are also called as a cancellous or trabecular bone. It is found in the long bones and it is surrounded by compact bone. While the compact bone, is also called as cortical bone, surrounds in the spongy bone. They are heavy, tough, and compact in nature. Okay, as you can see, the location of it, the surround of the spongy bone is the compact bone. So meaning to say the inside part is the spongy bone and the outer part is the compact bone. That is why it's called as a heavy and tough kasi it's like the protection of the spongy bone is the compact bone. So from the name itself lang naman makikita mo the differences between the both bone. Kasi bakit? From the spongy, which is somehow very or a trabecular bone, yung internal part, yung parang mas malambot na part ng bone is the spongy bone, and the compact bone, of course, the heavy and the tough kasi it is the protection of the inside or the internal of it, which is called as the spongy bone. Okay, let's proceed. So these are the types, of course. So I will be giving the definition of that in our further discussion. Okay, let's proceed. So compact bone looks solid but is very precisely structured. Compact bone is made of osteons or Haversian system, microscopic cylinders of bone matrix with osteocytes in concentric rings around central Haversian canals. So when we say osteon, also let's unlock the vocabulary here. So when we say osteon, it is the formation of the characteristics of mature bone, and it eventually takes shape during the process of bone remodeling or renewal. So that is osteons. While there's another term that we've encountered in that part. In this part is the Haversian canals. Haversian canals is actually the a microscopic tubes or tunnels in a cortical bone that house nerve fibers and few capillaries. So, meaning to say in the Haversian canals, it allows bone to get oxygen and nutrition without being highly vascular. So, it is also formed, or Haversian canals are formed by lamellae or concentric layers of the bone. When we say lamellae, it is the concentric layers of the bone. So let's go back on the osteons. So osteons, there's a question that is being asked in this part of osteons. What are osteons? We can eventually say that osteons is an osteocyte. Let's say that osteons actually refer to the chief structural unit of the compact bone. So that's why it's consists as it can consist by the lamellae or Haversian canals. So kaya siya sinabing it is a chief structural unit of compact bone, while osteocyte refer to the bone cell form when an osteoblast become embedded in the material of it. So meaning to say, it is the different from the vocabulary unlock. It is very different that the term or the function of osteons and the osteocytes. Okay. And yon. So, the question would be yung differences between osteons and osteocyte. May difference talaga sila from the function itself. So, where can we found this kind of osteons, or where can be found, or where our osteons are found? Saan ba natin pwedeng makita? What is the location of osteons? Of course, osteons is located on the long bones. So, the cylindrical cells of the most long bones in vertebrates is called or contains or often contains as osteons. Okay? So that's it. That is why, meaning to say, compact bone is eventually can be located in the long bones. That is why, kasi bakit? Osteons is presented in the long bones, and compact bones is made of osteons. Okay? Let's go now. So these are the part, osteon or Haversian system. So these are the part of it. So this is actually the location. So as you can see, the lamellae. So I will be discussing one by one of it. Okay? So let's proceed. Yon, another representation or another illustration. So the second type of a bone tissue is a spongy bone. It is very contradict, or it is very contrast to the first bone. Why? Because from the look itself, napaka literal na magkaiba. Why? Because spongy bone, which does look rather like a sponge with its visible holes or cavities. The cavities in the spongy bone often contain red bone marrow, which produces red blood cells, platelets, and the 5 kinds of white blood cells. I've already discussed the red bone marrow kanina. I've introduced to you guys the red bone marrow. Yes, so going back to it, when we say spongy bone, it is a very porous type of a bone found in animals. It is highly vascularized and contains red bone marrow, as I've said. And spongy bone is usually located at the end of the bone, or at the end of the long bone, or as it's actually called as epiphysis, with a harder compact bone surrounding it. So meaning to say, nasa end siya ng long bone. Mamaya makikita nyo yung illustration. And nasa loob siya. Si spongy bone nasa loob, at yung surround ni spongy bone is si compact bone. Which compact bone can protect your spongy bone. And saan din makikita si spongy bone? It is eventually can be located in the long bone also. Okay? So, what is the major function of the spongy bone? Spongy bone provides balance to dense and heavy compact bone by making the bone lighter so that the muscle can move them more easily. So, yan yung importance or yan yung function ni spongy bone. Kaya bakit tayo nakaka-bend? Bakit tayo nakaka-walk and run? Or bakit natin na-flex ang ating mga bone? Because of the spongy bone. Siya kasi yung nagde-dense, nagbabalance from the hard or the heavy compact from the heavy compact bone through to the lighter part, meaning to say the spongy bone brings the lighter bone so that the muscle can move them more easily. So, si spongy bone yan ang nabibigay ng balanse. Kasi bakit? Si compact bone, heavy na nga eh. Heavy, tough na. So, para mabalanse, like for example, the characteristic of a person, para mabalance mo ang characteristic of a person, you have to deal with your toughness, and of course, you have to deal with your softness. Para lang din yung bone mo. You have to deal with your toughness, which is the compact bone, and you have to deal with your softness, which is your spongy bone. Okay? So let's proceed. So I hope you understand the first slide. So let's proceed now to the second slide. So again, another picture of a bone. So kaya nga kanina I've mentioned the part which is called epiphysis. So the long bone. So ito, makita nyo dito ang epiphysis and diaphysis. So I will be what do you call this? Explaining that one in the further discussion today. Okay? So let's move. So let's move now. We've already done discussing the types of the bone, which is the compact bone and the spongy bone. Let's proceed now to the classification of a bone. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 classification of a bone. We have long bones. I've already mentioned that one. The short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. By each classification of a bone, of course, meron ding kaakibat na parte or parts. So let's proceed. Short, long, flat, sesamoid, and irregular. So this is the representation or the picture of it. So let's proceed. Another picture. This is for the bone types. Yes. Another picture. This is particularly on the long bones. What are those parts that you can see in the long bones? Yan. And okay. So and that's it. So that is the end part. Not the end part of our discussion, but the representation. Well, don't worry kasi i-explain natin yan. Ito siya picture lang kung paano nyo makita yung location ng different part ng isang classification of a bone. This one is particularly on the long bone. Also this one kasi may spongy bone and the compact bone. Okay, let's proceed. Another picture. So now let's now proceed on the definition itself. So there's there is a term here. Again, we have diaphysis. Diaphysis is made of compact bone and is hollow, forming a canal within the shaft. This marrow canal or medullary cavity contains yellow bone marrow, which is mostly adipose tissue. So meaning to say, in other words, in a simple words, the diaphysis is the main or midsection of a long bone. When we say midsection, meaning to say shaft, nasa center. Okay, it is made up of cortical bone or compact bone, and it is usually contains bone marrow and adipose tissue or the fat itself. It is a middle tubular part composed of compact bone which surrounds a central marrow cavity which contains red or yellow marrow. So that is diaphysis. To explain it in a simple words, yon. And the most important when we say diaphysis kasi, it is the center part, the middle part. That is why it's called midsection. That is why it's called shaft. Because it is the middle part of the long bone. Okay? That is why it's called also a medullary cavity kasi nasa center siya. Contradicting or comparing to the epiphyses are made of spongy bone. If the diaphysis is made up of compact bone, epiphyses are made of spongy bone. It covered with a thin layer of compact bone. Although red bone marrow is present in the epiphyses of children bones, it is largely replaced by yellow bone marrow in an adult bone. So meaning to say, when we say epiphysis, it is the expanded end of the long bones in an animals. It is connected to the bone shaft by epiphyseal cartilage or growth plate, which aids in the growth of the bone length and is eventually replaced by a bone. So that is epiphysis. So the major function of epiphysis is the where bone growth takes place. Yon. Yung grow ng bone dito na made sa epiphysis or it takes place in the epiphysis. Okay? So that is the differences between diaphysis and epiphysis. So diaphysis is made of compact bone and epiphysis are made of spongy bone. So now let's proceed to another slide. So the bones of the wrists and ankles are the tarsal and carpals. So tarsals and carpals can be found in the short bones or can be located in the short bones. And while in the flat bones, we have carnial bones, scapulae, sternum, and ribs. So these are the bones that is located in the flat bones. While in irregular bones, we have vertebrae and sacrum. Okay? So now let's proceed to the short, flat, and irregular bones are all made of spongy bone, covered with a thin layer called compact bone. Red bone marrow is found within the spongy bone. So the joint surfaces of bones are covered with the articular cartilage, which provides a smooth surface. So always remember that from the short bone to the irregular bone, short, flat, and irregular bone, it is all made up of spongy bone. Yung nag-iisa lang, si compact bone, because compact bone is made up of long bones. So, short bones, flat to irregular, spongy bone siya. Okay? So, aside from that, red bone marrow can be found also within the spongy bone. Yon. Or, when we say kasi red bone marrow, it is another name for blood cell production. So, meaning to say, blood cell production can be found within the spongy bone. While when we say articular cartilage, kasi isa rin to siya function, it said that the joint surfaces of the bones are covered with articular cartilage. Articular cartilage is a smooth, white tissue that covers the ends of the bones, where they come together to form joints. So articular cartilage can be damaged by injury or normal wear and tear. So that is the function or major function of articular cartilage. So that's it. That is the explanation with this slide. So let's proceed now to another. So this is actually the anterior view of the right knee. So from your femur to the other part of your right knee. So let's go back with the bones in the short bones. So when we see tarsal, it is actually a set of 7 irregular shaped bones. So eventually we can the location of the tarsal or the place of the tarsal is proximally in the foot or in the ankle area. So aside from tarsal, we also have carpals in the short bones. If the tarsal has seven small bones, the carpals naman has an 8 small bones that make up your wrist or it is also called as your corpus. So that is why it's called the bones of the wrist and ankles, kasi in ankles we have tarsals and wrist we have carpals. Let's go now to the different types of bone in the flat bones. So the ribs, shoulder blades, hip bones, and the cranial bones. So let's proceed now first to the cranial bone. Cranial bones is eventually the bones that make up the cranium. So the bones that make up the cranium, it's called a cranial bone. So there are I think no, it's to be exact, there are a lot of cranial bones from parietal, temporal, frontal, occipital, ethmoid, and sphenoid. It is actually part of our cranial bones. So let's not talk deep with that kasi the importance lang naman that you have to know the flat bones. What are those flat bones or what are those parts of the flat bones? So let's now go to the sternum or the rib part. So when we say sternum, it is eventually the bone that located in the middle part of our chest. It is also sometimes referred to the breastbone. So that is sternum. And sternum protects the organ of your torso from injury and also serves as the connection point for the other bones and the muscles. So as you can see, nandyan siya. Sternum, nasa middle part ni ribs. Okay? Let's go now to scapulae. Scapulae is an anatomy or it is known as a scapula, also known as the shoulder bone or shoulder blade. That's why you can see in the picture nasa bandang shoulder blade siya or wing bone. So that is the scapulae. While ribs, as we all know, is the protection of our internal organ, which is heart and lungs. Okay, let's proceed. We have, for the irregular bones, we have vertebrae and sacrum. It is bone from the your vertebrae and your facial bones. So that's it. That is the end of our discussion for the part 2 of the skeletal system. So if you have questions, you can eventually raise it in our GC. Hindi pa tayo tapos. We have part 3 of this discussion. Thank you very much.